Sorry, I got a phone call and I was trying to just get rid of the person, not answer the phone call, and something happened and it cut off the video. So I'm gonna post this in two videos. As I get better at this, I said at the beginning of this, hopefully I'm gonna get better at this. I'm gonna figure out how to take two videos, combine them together. It can't be that hard, but maybe I can figure that out in the next week and do that. All right, so we were talking about mead, and if you're growing impatient in this video, you think it's getting really long. Sorry about that, and I'll try to wrap it up real quick. Right? We're halfway through mead, though. Right? And I was talking about the self develops through stages according to Mead. Right? Another one of this kind of theories of development, successive stages. I already talked about imitation. I was in the middle of talking about the play stage, where typically it's like mother, father, things like that, right? People that are important agents of socialization is what we could call those, right? And that's what Mead calls significant other. Now, significant other, like that's a concept of Mead, but it kind of means something else in ordinary vernacular, right? If I told you, oh, next week I'm gonna have my significant other on the video, you would expect my wife, right? Or if I wasn't married, like my girlfriend or some romantic interest of mine, right? Mead's not really using this word significant other in the same sense. He's talking about people that are just important for socialization. For most people, that's their parents, their siblings, right? Those are significant others, right? When we're socialized when we're young, like we're not typically socialized by strangers, right? And for most people, it's like their family or the most important significant others, right? Eventually, that ability to take the role of others will develop more and more, and you'll stop having problems shifting from one character to the next, is how I put it, right? And this is what Mead calls the game stage, right? And there's a reason why he calls it the game stage, and he actually talks about baseball games, right? And we're about to get started in baseball, and like I'm my kid's baseball coach, and it's been really interesting over the last few years doing that. And you start off with t-ball, and here's the thing about t-ball: none of the kids know what to do, right? They'll do strange things like run to third base instead of first base. And so parents have to tell them. And so there'll be a lot of parents and the coach, right, and assistant coaches, and they hit the ball, run to first, right? And that really demonstrates the point that Mead made about baseball, is that in order to play baseball, you have to put yourself in the role of another person. When you hit that ball to shortstop, you have to know that shortstop's going to try to get you out at first, right? Later, you learn that it can get more complicated than that. For example, if someone's on third and trying to score, if someone's on first already, they might get a second. If there's one out, they might try to get a double play and stuff like that. But trust me, kids, when they play t-ball, they just can't do that, right? Now they do get older, and they do get smarter, and eventually they'll reach this kind of final stage of the generalized other, right? And Mead used baseball, but you can also use other sports, right? Here in the South, like most of us kind of know something about football, even if we didn't play, right? It's hard to avoid it. And in football, like there's offense and there's defense, right? And so this demonstrates like the generalized other, right? If you're a quarterback, you don't have to think, here's what number 2 is going to be, or even like here's what the safety is going to do, here's what the linebackers do. You can think, here's what the defense is going to do, right? Well, they're going to try to get the ball and they're going to run the opposite direction, right? They're going to try to tackle us, and and once players can do that, right? Infield versus outfield, batting team versus fielding team in baseball, then they can really grasp the game. And young kids can't do that. They have not reached the stage of the generalized other, right? Now, for me, what moves you from one to the next? Social experience, right? You interact, you play the game, right? You interact with language and skills, and you get coached and stuff like that, and that moves you, hopefully, if you don't quit the sport or whatever, or and this is not just sports, but it's like life in general, right? Eventually I have to earlier we were talking about teaching a class, right? I can teach a class and look out in the audience and oh, here's what I think Johnny thinks and Susan, but after a while I'm gonna say, if I say this, here's how most students will respond to that. That's the generalized other, right? And that's the final stage, right? So, some of the important things about this is Mead showed that symbolic interaction is the foundation for our identity. Our identity comes from interaction with others. That's the looking glass self, right? And it comes from our interaction with others, right? And so, it matters who you interact with, right? Boy, here's something to think about, right? Some parents do a good job and some parents do a bad job, right? If I want my kid to grow up and be confident in themselves, to not hesitate when they think they're right, to have a strong sense of self and respect themselves and have high self-esteem and all these things that most parents want, right? I should parent them in a way that develops those things, right? But if I'm not a good parent, I might, no, that's not how you do things, and you don't ever get anything right, and you're just a dumb kid, and you're never going to amount to anything. Well, that's the worst way you can parent a kid if you want them, right? Because they're looking at your face, right? And that's telling them who they are to a very large extent. And you remember when I was talking about myself, I think I'm smart and handsome and witty or whatever I said, right? And if you guys say, no, you're none of those things, right? That's the equivalent of doing that to your child, right? You remember when I was I got to humble myself and diminish my sense of self, right? So that's consistent with what I'm seeing in other people's faces, right? If I do that to a child, they're going to have no self-confidence, right? They are not going to believe that they're smart and capable, right? When you parent, you have to build up their sense of confidence, right? And I hope your parents did that, right? And I certainly hope that I do that for my own kids, right? And some days I do better than others. Hopefully I don't go to that extreme, but I have seen parents do that, right? And yeah. All right. Boy, that's a lot in there. Talk about one more idea and I'm going to stop, right? Really one idea at the very end of this that we need to talk about. And I just can't talk about socialization without mentioning this, right? There's a fella that's a student of Mead's, George Herbert Mead. And yeah, hopefully you've seen this pattern of like one person teaches and the next person further develops ideas and stuff like that. You see that with Freud and Piaget, and then Piaget and Kohlberg. You're seeing that now with Mead and Irving Goffman, right? So the very end of this chapter it talks about the work of Irving Goffman. And he believes pretty much everything that I just told you about George Herbert Mead, but he builds upon this. And in some of his work, he focuses upon what he calls total institutions. Total institutions are settings in which people are isolated from the rest of society and manipulated. Their sense of self is manipulated by an administrative self. These are prisons. These are immigration detention centers. These are asylums, mental hospitals, and stuff like that. And they are what Goffman calls radical experiments in altering people's personalities through direct control of the experiment, right? This is where resocialization, not socialization, not what begins at childhood like all the other theories we've talked about, but someone's sense of self, and they've already been socialized to some extent, but they want to tear down their sense of self and build up a new sense of self, right? That's the radical experiment in altering people's identities, right? And it is radical, right? Here's an example, right? I think I've mentioned several times that I am a sociologist, of course, but I'm also a criminologist, right? So I'm very much interested in prisons and jails and things of that sort, right? And in prisons, there's a process, like a depersonalization, dehumanization process. So when a person goes to prison, well, they're handcuffed typically, perhaps in the courtroom, or they appear for, their sentence or something like that. And there's kind of a ritual, right? I mean, not kind of, but there's definitely a ritual, right? If they're arrested and they're going to jail versus prison, like, put your hands behind your back and put the handcuffs on and put you in the back seat and press your head down below. If they like you, if they don't, maybe bang your head against, right? The car window as you're getting in. And they take you down the precinct, and this is a ritual. Everyone gets fingerprinted. Everyone gets a mugshot, right? You're assigned a number, and they refer to you as that number, right? This is also true of prison, right? They violate your bodily integrity. Strip down naked. Sometimes what they call a cavity search, right? It's letting you know that, we can do things to you now that we could not do to you previously, right? You don't even control your own body. You have no right to privacy. You don't get to decide when you wake up, when you eat, right? These are all the aspects of a total institution, right? They're controlling all of these things in your environment, right? Now, hopefully, well, I don't know. How do prisons do when they radically alter people's personalities? Do they alter them in a way that when they're released, they're not the same person and they go back out into society and they never commit crimes again? Prisons, that they might say that's their goal sometimes. But that's not the effect that they have in most cases, right? And Goffman knows this about total institutions, is generally speaking, they fail. But they persist despite failing over and over again, right? And, and that's kind of interesting, right? They don't really radically alter the sense of self in the in the way that the institution's own goals of like creating a law-abiding citizen, right? No, they don't, right? People might behave themselves for a while, but when they get back out, they'll kind of go back to their old self, and that includes their old behaviors and stuff like that, right? So total institutions often fail, but there are some that are more successful than others, right? Another total institution is like boot camp and prison, right? And and it goes through, a lot of the similar stuff. You live in a controlled environment, and the drill sergeant it tells you what to do, and you have to obey them and stuff like that. And it has a different goal, right? It's trying to turn you into a soldier. Maybe like a lean, mean fighting machine that's willing to serve, and if you're given an order, you obey it and stuff like that. And boot camps, they're pretty good at doing that, really, right? If they weren't, people wouldn't obey orders in the Army, and we wouldn't have a functioning Army, right? And boot camps can take a young and dumb teenager and turn them into a soldier in a very small amount of time, right? And get them to obey demands like almost without hesitation. Don't think about whether you should obey this man. You obey it instantly, right? They're very good at that. All of these radical experiments, though, in changing people's identity, they come at a cost, right? You just can't radically alter people's identity and it not have all sorts of negative consequences. And here's one of them. People, when you start tinkering with their identity and tearing down their old identity and building up a new one, people will crack quite often, right? In fact, they will commit suicide quite often. Sometimes they'll have emotional breakdowns, right? So, again, like I often thought these are radical experiments in changing the self, right? They work. You can argue they work in boot camps for most soldiers. But in boot camps, routinely, people do kill themselves. When people are committed to jails and prisons, they often commit suicide. People have mental breakdowns, right? Sometimes they kill other people, right? And that's kind of the dark side of total institutions, right? They do violence to the self, is one way of putting it. All right. That's it. Sorry it's so long. I did not keep it brief. But I think we talked about a lot of important stuff, right? And I hope you stuck it out. I'm going to remind you one more time, if you want to just read the chapters and not watch these videos, you don't have to. I'm trying to make them as interesting and exciting as I possibly can. And maybe I'll get better at that as I keep making these videos. And maybe I'll get better at editing them. Maybe I'll figure out how to get these microphones to work and the audio will improve. Just give me a little bit of time to learn all this stuff. And I hope that you'll see a better video product as we move through all these chapters. And by the end, it'll be much better than today. Although I don't feel like I did too bad, right? I did keep it a little bit. It was a lot longer than I would hope for, right? And I'll work on that, keeping things briefer. I'm failing miserably. I'm sorry about that. I'll keep them briefer. Have a good day. I hope y'all have enjoyed this.